welcome to the Thinking Stack. Let's be brutally honest with ourselves for a moment. That feel-good buzz we get from seeing a new tree planted downtown. Is it genuine progress, or is it just, well, a carefully cultivated illusion? We're told that urban greening is the future. You know, leafy sidewalks, rooftop gardens, parks as these great urban lungs.
Right, the narrative is very strong.
But what if that narrative is maybe more about soothing our anxieties than actually solving the real problems?
It's a thought, isn't it?
Think about it.
Yeah.
Are we turning to nature to genuinely transform our cities? Or maybe just to give ourselves a pat on the back while the underlying issues kind of fester?
It's definitely a question worth digging into. We see these images, these green utopias being pushed constantly, but it feels really prudent to examine that vision through, a much more rigorous lens. And we've gathered quite a bit of research here that lets us do just that, to dissect the common assumptions around urban greening and really try to understand what's going on beneath the pretty surface.
So what's the plan?
Well, our mission today is to use what we call the integrated thinking stack. We're going to look at the raw truth, the ethical side of things, the long-term consequences, human psychology, practical design, potential risks, and ultimately what it actually takes to execute meaningful change.
7 layers.
7 layers of scrutiny, no fluff, no fantasy, and definitely no greenwashing allowed.
Exactly. And look, we're not here to bash trees or parks. Nature in cities is good, obviously.
Of course.
But we do need to confront this nagging suspicion. Are we sometimes using nature as like a convenient distraction? Planting a tree to maybe offset the guilt of our carbon-heavy lifestyles?
The symbolic act?
Yeah, or slapping a green roof on a building and calling it climate action while totally ignoring the bigger picture like energy use or, urban sprawl.
It happens.
It feels like we need to strip away the marketing spin and the wishful thinking and just get down to what's actually happening.
Agreed.
So let's start with that first layer of our stack, cognitive cleanse. What does the hard data, the actual evidence, tell us about the impact of urban greening?
Right, let's clear the decks. When we look at air quality, for instance, the common assumption is pretty straightforward. More green space equals cleaner air. Simple.
Seems logical.
It does. But a really comprehensive study across Europe, published in PNAS just last year, 2023, it paints a much more nuanced picture. They looked at a huge network of monitoring stations, analyzing data for pollutants like nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter, PM10, PM2.5, and ozone.
And what did they find?
Well, they found the effect of urban green space on these pollutants was often surprisingly weak and highly variable.
Weak? Not what you'd expect.
Not at all. And what's particularly interesting, maybe even counterintuitive, is they're finding that right down at street level, where we actually live and breathe this assumed benefit, isn't consistently backed up by strong evidence.
So those beautiful tree-lined streets we imagine as these fresh air havens might not be.
Precisely.
Yeah.
There was actually a study back in 2012 by Pugh and colleagues that suggested in some situations, particularly in these street canyons, trees can actually hinder air quality.
Hinder it? How?
By blocking ventilation, basically trapping pollutants close to the ground instead of letting them disperse, like putting a lid on it.
Okay, wow. Trapping them.
Yeah, and it gets even more complex. There was some research out of Kansas City, modeling work by Zhang and others in 2020. They showed that more vegetation in the summer could actually lead to about a 10% increase in PM.
An increase? Why?
It seems it's because of reduced air mixing at night. The trees cool the surface, which can lower what's called the planetary boundary layer, basically. The atmospheric lid gets lower, trapping pollutants near the ground, especially at night.
So the cooling effect, which we think is good,
can sometimes have this unintended consequence for air quality under specific conditions. It's complicated. As that PNAS study put it quite bluntly, the common assumption that urban greening straightforwardly improves air quality is not supported by robust evidence at street level. It's a real reality check.
Okay, a big one. So maybe the air purifying superpower is, let's say, exaggerated. What about cooling? We all feel it, right? A shady tree on a hot day, that must be more straightforward.
Trees certainly help, yes. Shade and evapotranspiration, that process where water evaporates from leaves, definitely contribute to local cooling. That part is true.
But I sense a but coming.
Well, it's not quite linear. A 2023 report in the journal Forests highlighted that the cooling efficiency isn't uniform. It turns out small and medium-sized parks tend to give you the most cooling bang for your buck. sort of per unit area.
Interesting.
Yeah, you get diminishing returns once parks get really big. Bigger isn't always better for cooling efficiency.
So maybe lots of smaller green spots are better than one giant park?
Potentially, yeah. And there was another study, PNAS again, just this year, 2024, that described a kind of power law for tree canopy cooling. What that means is you get a fast increase in cooling benefits when you start adding trees, like at small scales.
Okay.
But then the effect starts to plateau as you add more and more canopy cover over a larger area.
So targeted greening makes more sense for cooling than just, say, blanket tree planting.
It suggests that, yes, strategic placement seems key for maximizing that cooling benefit.
Okay. Let's tackle the really big one then. Carbon sequestration. Can our city trees honestly make a dent in the absolutely massive amounts of CO2 our cities pump out?
Right, the climate change angle. Globally, estimates suggest urban trees store something like 7.4 billion tons of carbon.
Sounds like a lot.
It does. And they sequester, or pull out of the air, about 217 million tons each year.
Okay, still sounds significant.
In isolation, yes. But then you look at the other side of the ledger. Cities are responsible for over 70% of global CO2 emissions. That's according to the IPCC's big 2022 report.
Okay, context matters.
Hugely. Suddenly, that 217 million tons starts to look, well, pretty modest in comparison.
Right, a small fraction.
Exactly. There was even an optimistic modeling study for Chicago done by Argonne National Labs in 2023. They looked at a best-case scenario, lots of irrigation, and found that even then, the trees could only offset maybe 35 to 50% of summer traffic emissions.
Only traffic. And only summer.
Yes, and it's temporary, seasonal, and needs a lot of water. So, in the grand scheme of a city's total carbon footprint, the impact of trees sequestering carbon it's more symbolic, really, than a primary solution.
Okay, good to know. What about managing stormwater runoff? Green roofs, tree canopies, surely they make a big difference there.
They can definitely contribute, yes. Tree canopies can intercept maybe 20 to 30% of rainfall before it even hits the ground.
That helps.
It does. And green roofs, according to a U.S. EPA report from 2020, can be even better. They can reduce runoff by like 60 to 100%, depending on the storm.
Wow, up to 100%.
In some cases, for certain types of storms and roof designs, yes. But, and this is a really crucial but, the actual effectiveness hangs heavily on local conditions.
Like what?
Soil type underneath, the intensity and duration of the rain, the specific tree species you use, and critically, how well everything is maintained.
Maintenance.
Absolutely. Clay soils might see more benefit than sandy ones, for example. And a green roof that's neglected, maybe the drains are clogged, it's not going to manage much stormwater at all.
So it's a tool, but not a magic bullet.
Yeah.
Needs the right conditions and upkeep.
Precisely. It's one piece of the puzzle, not a guaranteed fix everywhere.
Got it. And lastly for this layer, what about noise? The constant city buzz. Can green spaces offer some quiet?
Yeah, there's some good news there. Research published in Frontiers in 2023 indicates that green spaces can indeed reduce noise levels, typically in the range of, say, 4 to 14 decibels.
That sounds noticeable.
It can be. The key factor seems to be the density and layout of the vegetation. Denser plantings, especially closer to the ground, are better at absorbing and scattering sound waves.
So thick hedges are good.
Exactly. Or a densely planted buffer zone. Interestingly, the height of the trees seems to matter less than having that dense understory or closely spaced trees near the noise source.
Okay, that makes sense. So after this first layer, this cognitive cleanse, the picture feels, well, a lot more complex than just green is good.
That's the main takeaway, I think. Urban greening does have real, localized benefits: cooling, some stormwater help in the right places, noise reduction. But its impact on the really big systemic challenges, like citywide air pollution and climate change mitigation, it's often smaller, much more variable, and frankly, less reliable than the popular narrative suggests.
So we need to be careful.
Very careful. Wary of overstating the benefits, and definitely need to invest more in actually measuring and evaluating what these projects achieve. Green initiatives need solid evidence, not just, good intentions.
Which leads us perfectly into our second layer, moral intelligence. Given this more complex truth, what are the ethical dimensions? Are we actually doing the right thing with how we approach urban greening?
Yeah, this is where it gets really sticky. One of the big ethical flags that comes up is this idea of, moral outsourcing.
Moral outsourcing, what do you mean?
Are we essentially building these resource-hungry, polluting cities and then kind of asking trees and parks to clean up our mess, ethically speaking, to sort of absolve us?
Like
Yeah.
planting a tree makes up for the factory emissions.
Kind of. The philosopher Val Plumwood talked about the danger of instrumentalizing nature, basically,
Hmm.
reducing living ecosystems to just tools for our convenience.
Right.
And urban greening can easily fall into that trap. Trees become janitors, parks become potential sacrifice zones for higher rents. Nature becomes a way to cleanse our conscience.
And this isn't real stewardship.
It risks becoming moral displacement. The symbolic act replaces the harder work of actual systemic change.
And the research points to some serious justice issues too, right?
Yeah.
Who actually benefits from this greening?
Exactly. This is crucial. Study after study, like those from the European Environment Agency in 2022 and Locke and colleagues in 2023, show that low-income communities and communities of color consistently have less access to green space.
Less trees, fewer parks.
Significantly less. We know that historically redlined neighborhoods, those subjected to discriminatory housing practices, often have something like 30% less tree canopy cover even today.
30%. That's huge.
It is. And compounding that, their voices, the residents' input, are frequently ignored when new green projects are planned for their areas or nearby.
So the benefits aren't shared equally.
Not even close. And then there's the whole phenomenon of green gentrification. This has been explored really well by researchers like Engelowski since around 2020.
Green gentrification, meaning green spaces make areas too expensive.
Essentially, yes. Developers see green amenities, a new park, a tree-lined street, as a way to boost property values. Which sounds good, maybe, but it often leads to rising rents and property taxes, pushing out the long-term, often lower-income residents. The very people who might need those green spaces the most suddenly can't afford to live there anymore.
So the greening actually displaces people.
It can, absolutely, which forces us to ask a really tough ethical question. Are we greening cities to genuinely heal them and improve life for everyone? Or are we, maybe unintentionally, just making them prettier and more desirable for the people who can already afford to stay?
Are we helping the city or just the privileged parts of it?
That's the core ethical dilemma. Is it about justice or just aesthetics and market value?
Okay, heavy stuff. Let's move to layer 3, systemic foresight. Looking ahead, what are the potential knock-on effects, the unintended consequences of how we're doing urban greening now?
Well, we just touched on gentrification, and the research gives us some pretty stark examples of how these unintended consequences play out. In Barcelona, for instance, their Superblock initiative aimed to create these great pedestrian-friendly green spaces.
Sounds good.
It does, but some studies indicate it actually led to an increase in income inequality within those areas
Ooh.
by making them more desirable, pushing up values, potentially displacing lower earners. Similarly, in New York City, the famous High Line Park.
Yeah, everyone loves the High Line.
Visually stunning, yes. But research by Gould and Lewis in 2017 linked it to the displacement of long-term Black residents in nearby areas like Prospect Park, again, due to rising property values.
So even celebrated projects can have this dark side.
They absolutely can if equity isn't built in from the start. Well-intentioned greening can definitely worsen existing inequalities.
What about our habits, like driving? Does making suburbs greener make us drive less?
You'd hope so, but the evidence isn't really there. An OECD report from 2023 highlighted this. If you just make suburbs greener, add more trees, maybe some parks, without fundamentally changing transportation infrastructure, like adding good public transit or designing for walkability,
Then what happens?
you can actually reinforce sprawl. People might move to these nicer, greener suburbs, feel good about the trees, but still rely entirely on their cars for everything.
So greenwashed sprawl.
Pretty much. You get more driving, just maybe with a slightly clearer conscience because there are trees around.
Oh.
It doesn't tackle the root problem of car dependency.
Are there ecological downsides too? Things we might not think about.
Definitely.
Mhm.
A USDA report from 2023 pointed out our tendency in cities to plant, well, a very limited range of trees. Usually ones that grow fast, look nice, and don't need much care.
Sounds practical.
Short term, maybe, but long term, it often creates these ecological dead zones, basically monocultures that lack biodiversity.
And that's bad because...
Because they're incredibly vulnerable. Think about Dutch elm disease wiping out elms, or the emerald ash borer devastating ash trees. One pest or disease can sweep through and destroy a huge chunk of the urban forest if it's all the same few species. It's a massive ecological risk.
monocultures are risky. Anything else?
Yeah, something slightly unexpected.
Pollen.
Pollen. There's a common practice, especially in cities, to plant mostly male trees
Why male trees?
because they don't produce fruit or seed pods, which can be seen as messy on sidewalks.
Less cleanup. Makes sense.
From a maintenance perspective, maybe. But male trees are the ones that produce pollen. So if you overplant them, you end up with really high levels of airborne pollen,
Lead view.
worse allergies, more asthma attacks. The U.S. Forest Service noted this back in 2023. So a choice made for tidiness has real public health consequences.
Wow. Never thought of that.
And we also have to remember those potential air quality issues we talked about earlier, adding green stuff in a way that accidentally reduces ventilation or traps smog near the ground at night.
Right, the unintended system effect.
Exactly. It just shows how interconnected everything is. You can't just drop in some trees without thinking about the ripples across the whole urban system. Things can backfire.
It really highlights the complexity. Okay, let's shift gears a bit to the psychological side. Layer 4, embodied insight. What's our deep connection to nature, and how does that play into all this?
Well, there's this idea, the biophilia hypothesis, that humans have this innate, evolved need to connect with nature.
We like being around plants and animals.
Fundamentally, yes. And there's loads of research supporting it. A big review in 2022 in PMC pulled together studies showing being around trees really does calm us down, lower heart rate, less stress hormones like cortisol, better focus, even better sleep. Feels good.
It absolutely does. But you mentioned a trap.
Yes, the potential trap is confusing what feels good with what is actually doing good systemically.
The feel-good factor again.
Exactly. The outline mentions the scenario and it resonates, right? Someone drives their big SUV out to a nature trail,
Okay.
goes for a short hike, snaps a selfie, maybe hashtags it, hashtag green life or something,
See it all the time.
and feels really virtuous, really connected to nature, even though their overall lifestyle, the driving, the consumption might be the actual problem.
Right. The hike makes them feel okay about the SUV.
It's a form of cognitive dissonance reduction. Doing these small, visible, green things, planting a tree, recycling a cup, taking that hike, can give us this psychological relief. It makes us feel like we've done our part.
So we don't feel so bad about the bigger stuff. We're not changing.
Precisely. It makes it easier to avoid the harder, more significant systemic changes that are truly needed for sustainability. The report calls greening a potential psychological offset for these deeper dysfunctions.
A way to buy ourselves out of guilt, almost.
In a sense. Meanwhile, those really ingrained habits, like relying on cars, they persist. An ASU study mentioned for 2025 suggested over half of trips, even in dense cities, are still by car. That's a huge muscle memory.
And planting trees along the road won't fix that.
Not on its own, no. Trees don't break that habit loop. What breaks it is fundamental urban design change, better transit, safer bike lanes, walkable neighborhoods, things that make not driving the easy, obvious choice.
So our love for nature is real, but we can misuse it psychologically.
We have to be careful not to let that genuine desire for connection become a substitute for the harder work of actual green reform.
Okay. Which brings us neatly to layer 5, human-centered design. How do real people, actual residents, interact with these green spaces day to day? Are we designing for them or just for pictures?
Yeah, this is critical. And too often it really does feel like we're designing for the glossy renderings, not the lived reality.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. A beautiful park might show up on a city plan 300 meters from someone's home. Looks great on paper.
Sounds accessible.
But if the roads between their home and that park are basically death traps for pedestrians, fast traffic, no crosswalks, then that park is effectively useless to them. It might as well be miles away.
Accessibility isn't just distance, it's safety and ease of getting there.
Exactly. Or take those green walls on buildings. They can look nice, sure, but they don't help the residents much if the green premium means their rent just doubled and they're worried about eviction.
The aesthetic benefit doesn't outweigh the economic hardship.
Not usually, no. And we see these design flaws everywhere, bike lanes that just disappear into traffic, tree-lined boulevards that lead to giant parking lots or highways. It undermines the whole point.
It feels like checking a box rather than creating functional systems.
Right. And there's also the issue of designing parks with a very narrow user group in mind. The research, like that Taylor and Francis study from 2023, really highlights this.
What did it find?
It found that different communities often use parks very differently. Black and Latino communities, for example, might prioritize things like lots of seating for large group gatherings, shaded areas for picnics, and feeling safe and secure.
Okay.
But many parks seem designed primarily for, say, individual jogging, maybe some yoga classes, or off-leash dog areas, activities that don't necessarily match the needs or preferences of everyone in the community.
So some people might just not feel welcome or comfortable using the space.
Exactly. It leads to avoidance. The park is there, technically, but it's not serving the whole community because the design didn't consider diverse needs.
It's a one-size-fits-all approach that doesn't fit all.
Precisely. And then you get the broader greenwashing developers sticking a token green roof on a luxury condo and calling it climate action. Or cities publishing these ambitious, glossy, green master plans. But with no real funding attached, no accountability, no teeth. They look good in press releases, but they don't translate into real change on the ground.
So we've basically perfected greenwashing in urban form.
We've gotten very, very good at it.
Yeah.
Creating the appearance of sustainability often seems prioritized over delivering actual, equitable, functional green spaces for the people who live there.
Okay, let's stress test this a bit more with layer 6. Risk and resilience. What are the potential weak points? What happens if we're wrong about how well this works, or if things don't go as planned?
This is about looking at the vulnerabilities. While greening can offer some local resilience benefits, helping cool things down, soaking up some rainwater, we need perspective, a 2024 publication in PMC really emphasized that true urban resilience, especially against big shocks like disasters or economic downturns, relies much more on things like disaster preparedness, economic diversity, strong social networks.
Things far beyond just planting trees.
Far beyond. And the green infrastructure itself is actually quite vulnerable. Urban trees have a tough life.
How so?
Well, research from Oxford University Press in 2024 points out they face way more stress than rural trees. Intense heat waves reflected off pavement, prolonged droughts with no buffer, soil getting compacted by traffic and construction, salt runoff in the winter. It leads to higher mortality rates.
So city trees are more likely to die.
Often, yes, they're living in a harsher environment. And remember that monoculture risk we talked about?
Yeah, planting only a few species.
That USDA warning from 2023 is key here. If you rely heavily on just one or two types of trees for your urban forest, you're incredibly exposed. One disease, one pest, and you could lose a huge chunk of your green cover almost overnight. That's not resilient.
Okay, disease risk. What else?
Maintenance failure. This is huge. Green roofs, for example, can fail pretty spectacularly if they're poorly designed initially, if the irrigation system breaks down and isn't fixed, or if the drains get blocked and nobody clears them.
Turning a green roof into a leaky roof.
Or just a dead, weedy patch. Parks, too, without consistent funding for upkeep, mowing, repairs, trash collection, they degrade quickly. King County documented these issues back in 2022. A neglected park isn't providing many benefits.
So the initial planting is just the start. The follow-through is crucial and often lacking.
Very often, yes. Which leads to the biggest risk, over-reliance. If cities treat greening as their main climate strategy while maybe not doing enough on emission cuts or other adaptations.
They're putting all their eggs in a fragile basket.
Exactly. They're betting heavily on a system that's vulnerable to climate stress, disease, and budget cuts, while the underlying problems might be getting worse. That's a really risky gamble.
The green veneer could crack easily under pressure.
It could, if we don't build in robust maintenance, manage the ecological risks, and integrate greening into a much broader resilience strategy.
Okay, so given all these complexities and risks, what does work? Let's get to our final layer, number 7, execution engine. What does effective urban greening actually look like on the ground?
Right. It's not all negative. There are definitely promising approaches and successful examples out there. Barcelona's superblocks, which we mentioned earlier regarding gentrification risk, do show potential when done right. The core idea of reclaiming significant road space from cars and turning it into green corridors, places for people, that's powerful.
But the key is managing the side effects.
Absolutely. Pairing that kind of spatial redesign with strong policies to protect tenants and control rents is crucial to avoid displacement. Integration is key.
Any other examples?
Lancaster, Pennsylvania is often cited for its really integrated strategy. They didn't just have a parks department doing parks and a water department doing stormwater. They coordinated across departments.
The breaking down silos.
Exactly. Thinking about green infrastructure as a system that cuts across traditional city functions. Also, the rise of tactical urbanism is interesting.
Tactical urbanism, like quick, temporary projects.
Yeah, things like pop-up parks, temporary bike lanes, or those traveling tree corridors they did in Munich. Quick, low-cost, often community-led ways to test out green ideas, see how they work in reality, build support, before committing to huge, permanent changes.
Learning by doing, basically.
Precisely. And when you look at these more successful initiatives, you see some common threads emerging.
Such as?
They almost always integrate greening with transportation planning. It's not an afterthought. They explicitly address housing justice and equity to prevent gentrification. They focus on the quality and ecological function of the green space, not just planting quotas or acreage targets.
Quality over quantity.
Yes. They also track metrics that matter actual outcomes, like changes in travel behavior, health improvements, biodiversity counts, not just inputs like number of trees planted. And critically, they involve genuine community power, giving residents real say in planning and implementation.
So what's a big shift needed then?
It's moving from just plant more stuff to systemic thinking, less focus on planting quotas, more on integrated planning, less focus on ribbon cuttings and optics, more on securing long-term operating budgets for maintenance, less PR about grand master plans, more testing and prototyping on the ground.
Get real, basically.
Get real. Urban greening can be a powerful tool, but only when it's deeply woven into the fabric of how we manage transportation, energy, housing, and land use. It can't just be a green layer troweled on top of an unsustainable system. It has to be part of transforming the system itself.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this all up, bringing together everything we've dissected through the 7 layers of our integrated thinking stack.
Right. So layer 1, cognitive clarity. Urban greening offers definite local help, especially for cooling and maybe noise, but its impact on big systemic issues like air quality and carbon is often modest, variable, and context-dependent.
Layer 2, moral intelligence. There's real hypocrisy if we use greening to offset pollution or make ourselves feel good while ignoring or even worsening environmental injustice and displacement. Green gentrification is a serious ethical concern.
Layer 3, systemic foresight. The unintended consequences are real. Risks of deepening inequality, reinforcing car-dependent sprawl if not integrated with transport, creating fragile monocultures, even causing allergy spikes. It's complex.
Layer 4, embodied insight. Our innate love for nature provides psychological comfort, which is valuable, but it's not a climate strategy. And we can easily use that good feeling to avoid harder, necessary green reforms.
Layer 5, human-centered design. Too often, green spaces are designed for pictures, not people. They fail to meet diverse needs, lack safe access, or are undermined by economic pressures. Inclusion is often an afterthought, leading to greenwashing.
Layer 6, risk and resilience. Urban green infrastructure itself is fragile, vulnerable to climate stress, disease, and especially lack of maintenance. Over-relying on it as a primary solution without addressing root causes is a significant risk.
And finally, layer 7, execution engine. What works involves systems thinking, integrating greening with transport, housing, energy. It needs a focus on equity, quality over quantity, prototyping, community power, and crucially, long-term operational support, not just planting drives.
So distilling it down, what's the final, maybe uncomfortable takeaway?
I think it's this. Planting a tree won't save the city, but it might just save your illusion that you're doing enough.
Oof, okay.
If we genuinely want cities that breathe, cities that are healthy, equitable, and sustainable, we need to do so much more than just photosynthesize on the margins.
We need to.
We need to decarbonize our energy and transport. We need to decommodify essentials like housing and maybe even water. And we need to democratize the processes, giving real power to communities.
Greening isn't the enemy then?
Not at all. Nature in cities is vital. But greening becomes detrimental when it's used as a superficial fix, a delay tactic, a way to avoid those deeper, harder systemic changes. If we do that, we risk ending up with, well, beautifully landscaped ruins.
Yeah, powerful image. This has been The Thinking Stack. We've tried, as always, to cut through the noise with clarity, layer by layer. Please share this, discuss it, question these ideas, and demand more than just green window dressing in your own communities. Stay sharp, stay grounded, stay green, but not delusional.